This is Eskelin, CEO of Peak Portfolio. Today I'm going to be sharing best practices in sales technology, vendor selection, and negotiation. As sales and marketing professionals, you're typically on the selling side of this process. In this presentation, we'll not only help you select sales technology, but we're also going to give you some insights into what happens on the buyer side of the negotiating table. Let's start off with some questions about your current vendors. Why are some companies held back by their vendors' performance, while others are better off because of their vendors' performance? Why are some companies pushing their vendors to a best practice, while others are being pulled to a best practice by their vendors? And how is it that some vendor relationships grow stale over time, while others grow stronger and more strategic over time? In this presentation, I'm going to share with you 5 best practices for technology vendor selection. These best practices will help you select the right vendors and negotiate successful long-term relationships. So best practice number 1, formal vendor selection process. I'm going to share with you our formal vendor selection process. We start at a high level with planning, selection, and negotiation. And now let's dive into more detail on the selection process. In round 1, we're going to have an education focus. This would typically be an RFI that validates minimum requirements and gets a letter back from the vendors showing their interest in competing for your business. Round 2 has a quantitative focus, and that's where you're going to have something structured like an RFP where you dive into requirements and questions to help differentiate the vendors and ensure that they can meet your requirements in detail. Round 3 is a qualitative focus, and that's where you have on-site demos and presentations, and you're going to be calling customer references and maybe even doing customer site visits. Round 4 is focused on validation. It's an optional round, and that would typically be used if during rounds 1 through 3 you realize that you need to test and validate some of the things that the vendors are saying. And that might be done in a production pilot, it could be done in a conference room pilot, or maybe it's benchmarking at a testing facility. And the last round is pricing negotiations. And that's going to be where you dive into the details with your final vendors. There's going to be some negotiating that takes place on the far right during the negotiation phase, but you're going to have some during the selection process as well to make sure that pricing is factored into the decision process. And last, you've got your decision, and that's going to be how do you take rounds 1 through 5 and all the information that you've learned on the vendors and bring the team to a decision on what vendor is going to be best for their organization. So it's very focused on building consensus on the decision. And now let's talk a little bit about why we have 5 rounds. Why not just do all of these things? The reason is that these evaluation activities get more expensive as you go through the rounds. And so therefore you want to have less vendors as you go through each step of the process. So in round 1 you're typically going to have 10 to 20 vendors receiving an RFI. It's a very low cost activity. And that's going to help you narrow that list and make sure you're only talking to companies that really qualify for your minimum hard requirements. Round 2 is going to be a little bit more expensive. It's going to have an RFP, and that's where you want to get it down to 6 to 8 vendors. And that's not just a cost thing, but it's also just logistically scoring 6 to 8 vendors' proposals can take a lot of time for your selection team. So you really want to get that list down to the 6 to 8 players who really do have an opportunity to win this business. Round 3 is going to be a little bit more expensive because that's where you start having travel involved on both sides. So it might be travel for the vendor to come to your facility and present. You might be going to the vendor's facility to evaluate their operations. Or you may even be going to customer facilities to see the vendor's tools and technologies in action. So round 3 can be pretty expensive. Round 4 is typically the most expensive, especially if you're doing a production pilot. So you're definitely going to want to get it down to your finalists before you get into any kind of validation. And then pricing is going to have some travel involved if you're doing face-to-face negotiations. So you want to get that down at least to the top 2 or 3 before you start getting into that. And the last thing I want to talk about here is some descriptors that we've created to help our clients understand better these different phases. So round 1 we like to say this is the phase where you educate us. Round 2 is where you tell us, so that would be like an RFP. Round 3 is show us, that's where you do the demos. Round 4 is prove it. And then round 5 is earn it. Now let's talk about best practice number 2. The scoring matrix enables an educated and objective decision. So here's an example of a scoring matrix that we created for a client last year. And as you can see here, we've got some high-level sections. We've got strategic vendor, POS software, that's point of sale, back-of-house software, this is for a retail organization. We've got integration on the right side, hardware, services, and then technology. And you can see we've allocated some percentages. We like to take 100% and break that out by the different categories. And in this case, this was actually 4 different vendor selections. We combined them all into one RFP because some of the vendors performed all of these. They had the point of sale software, the back of house software, and they had the hardware and services to support it. And the client wasn't sure if they were going to go with one vendor for everything or if they were going to go with the best of breed approach. So to create some efficiencies, we created one RFP for all of it, and then we negotiated and made selection decisions independently on each one. You'll also notice that we have a lot of subcategories under each major category, and we've divided percentages out for each of those. And then the ultimate end result is going to be where you have your vendors 1 through 8 all listed as their own row or their own columns, and you can see their scoring and where the top scorers are in each of those categories. So this is a great tool for breaking out your decision into many small decisions, and that in itself helps you objectify the decision as much as you can. If a lot of these become subjective decisions, at least you're breaking it down to a lot of small subjective decisions. And then also, it helps you define your priorities and understand why maybe one vendor might be better for another company, but they're not the best vendor for your company. Now, the other thing we like to do is use the scoring matrix as a way to build the RFP. So first step would be to define your high-level categories and break out your weighting by those high-level categories. Next step is you're going to take each one of those and you're going to break those into the subcategories and apply weighting to those. So we've shown that on the previous slide. But the important thing here is step number 3, which is define RFP questions that will help you score the subcategories. One of the worst things that can happen is you send out an RFP, you receive 8 responses back, and maybe there's hundreds of questions that you go through, and a lot of them are yes and no on functionality. And then when you go to sit down and score the RFP, in the scoring matrix, you realize that you didn't ask questions that help you differentiate the vendors, or you maybe didn't ask questions that help you with a particular subcategory. And that puts you in a position where the scoring matrix becomes useless because you didn't really get the information that you needed to properly fill it out. So an RFP not only has to have requirements and validate functionality for documentation purposes, but it also needs to ask questions that will help you score the scoring matrix at the end so that you can help it make an informed decision. Now let's move to best practice number 3, which is leverage an online RFP tool for efficiency. So what are some of the benefits of an online RFP tool? So first off, it avoids a table full of binders or a massive consolidated spreadsheet of RFP responses. So if you've been around long enough, you probably, before we had online RFP tools, maybe had the experience of going through binders and binders of information. Or maybe you were, as sales and marketing professionals, maybe you were the ones that were creating those binders. But imagine having 6 to 8 binders spread across the table with 7 or 8 people trying to read the same answer to, or all the answers to the same question and score a vendor. And it can be quite a task. So that obviously was the worst case scenario. Then spreadsheets became kind of the go-to. But even with spreadsheets, try consolidating the columns into one massive spreadsheet where you've got a lot of text in some of the cells, you've got pictures, maybe even attachments that don't really fit. And then trying to score that massive spreadsheet. And lastly, pulling that score into more of a summary scoring matrix view. And if you wanted to track the score for each team member, that makes it even more complex. So while spreadsheets can be an easy thing to create, trying to create a spreadsheet for an RFP response and make it usable and effective is a nightmare. So along comes the online RFP tool and saves the day. And so let's talk about some of the benefits. The library of questions for use in multiple RFPs. So the RFP tool that we use allows us to save categories of questions. And so a good example of this would be the technology section. If you're doing a cloud solution, if you're selecting a cloud solution. It's going to be the same technology questions for every cloud solution that you select. Your architecture team is going to have the same types of questions for architecture, for security, for backup and recovery, disaster recovery. All those questions are going to be very similar for every cloud solution. So what you can do is you can spend the time to do a proper job of defining those questions once, save them in a library, and then every RFP after that you can just drop that category in there and use that for every RFP instead of creating it from scratch each time. Another huge time saver is pre-scoring multiple choice questions. So what this means is you can create drop-downs for multiple choice. You don't share with the vendors what those scores are, but you can create a standard score for different answers. And so what we would like to do is, if it's a functionality type of question, then we would have a standard set of responses, and it might be something like a 4 is meets and exceeds requirements, a 3 means they meet requirements, a 2 says they're going to meet the requirements within 6 to 12 months, and a 1 would be it meets the requirements with a third-party solution add-on. 0 would be it doesn't meet the requirements and they don't plan to meet the requirements. And so by pre-scoring those multiple choice options, what happens is you get 6 to 8 vendor RFP responses back, and you've already got 60 to 70% of your questions scored before you even start the scoring process. So that can save you a ton of time. Another benefit is creating multiple weighting sets. So you might have multiple stakeholder organizations. The RFP that I just, or the scoring matrix that I just showed you a minute ago had an RFP for a retail systems selection process, and it was a franchisor who had multiple brands, and each of those brands had very different requirements when it came to point of sale and back of house and so forth. And so what this tool allowed us to do is create multiple weighting sets. So in the case of one brand, their priorities might be more on the technology, whereas on the other brand it might be more on the services. And a very similar benefit is not only can you create different weighting sets, but you can also create different scoring sets. And what that means is those different brands' stakeholders can score the RFP responses themselves. And you can pull together a group of scorers and show their scores separately from everybody else. So what that allows you to do is to say, what does this brand favor? You know, how do they score the RFP versus the others? And if you apply the weighting that factors in their priorities, you may come up with a very different answer for one brand or one stakeholder than you do for another. And lastly, we've got predefined reports in multiple formats and the ability to export to Excel or PDF. That can be a huge time savings as well. Most likely you're probably going to export to Excel and put your formatting on it before you present it to a steering committee. But during the process of scoring RFPs, it's nice to be able to pull the formatted reports up and see how the vendors are stacking up, and help you also realize which sections you might have missed the scoring on. So let's show you an example of an online RFP tool that we use. So this is going to be a series of screenshots just to give you an idea of what an online RFP tool might look like. So you can see on the left side here we've got the standard RFP sections on the top left, and then we've got the questions on the bottom left. The right side will be all your content. And so this is just an example of a question, a type of question that RFP tool has, where not only can you do multiple choice and radio buttons, but you can also do a grid type question like this one here, where you've got rows and columns. The important thing to remember here is when you do scoring, you're only scoring the overall question, not each individual cell here. So you want to make sure you break it out in a way that you're able to score what you want to score separately. You've also got the ability to upload attachments for the vendors to upload attachments, or you can upload a file that the vendors would download for reference. On this screen you can see the weighting. So there's a drop-down box under Edit Weightings. That's where you select the weighting set, and then you would fill in the weightings for that particular stakeholder group. Here's a screen that shows when you're scoring the RFP responses, you can see each vendor's answer to that particular question stacked on top of each other. So you can see here I scored vendor 1 a 4, vendor 2 a 3, And if there are more vendors, they would be below that. You can keep scrolling down and scoring. And then you can jump back to a screen that shows the scores for the particular category and all the subcategories under it. And the nice thing about this is it gives you at a glance an idea of where the vendors are standing, but also shows you which ones you haven't scored yet. So it makes it easy for you to drill in and out and make sure that you've scored every single question for each vendor. And then the last screen here just shows an example of an online scoring matrix that you can pull up as you're going through this process and see where the vendors are, how they're stacking up as you're going through and scoring it. And then of course you can see the little Excel button there where you can export it to Excel, and that's where you might apply the formatting to be something similar to what I showed you earlier on the scoring matrix slide. So now best practice 4, stakeholder alignment on vendor decision. So how do you get this alignment? First of all, you got to make sure you've identified all the stakeholders. You know, it's a bad idea to go forward without doing a thorough project charter where you define all the stakeholder groups, because worst case scenario is you go through this whole process and then one of the critical users of the technology raises their hand and says, we weren't included. And now you've got to step back and go through everything with that vendor again, or with that stakeholder group. Take them through every single step again. It slows things down and adds a lot of work. So best case scenario is you identify all the stakeholders up front, figure out who's going to represent them in this process, and make sure that they're involved in defining the priorities and so forth. Then you're going to want to involve them in the project charting. So we talked a little bit about that. They define the priorities along with the rest of the team. They help define the scope, agree on who the decision maker is going to be and who is going to be trying to influence that decision. We talked about just previously these next 2 bullets, which is creating both the weightings for the stakeholder groups and then creating separate scoring for their stakeholder groups. And so the nice thing about this is there is going to be a case where one vendor or one stakeholder group decides that one vendor is best for them, and another stakeholder group decides that another vendor is best for them. And if you didn't have those weightings and scoring separately, you know, you wouldn't really be able to articulate that very well to the decision maker. Now, it's not always easy to make a decision on which one's best when you've got different stakeholder groups championing different vendors, but at least the decision maker is going to make an informed decision. You want to invite stakeholder representatives to all the evaluation activities. They may not show up, but at least they've had the opportunity. That makes it a little bit more difficult for them to say they weren't involved. And last, you want to include them in the decision meeting so the decision maker can factor in all their perspectives. Best practice number 5, optimize perceived leverage for negotiations. So let's talk a little bit about perceived leverage. So the first one is only perceived leverage matters. If you have leverage and the other side doesn't realize it, you really don't have leverage. And vice versa. If they think they have leverage and they don't, they still have the leverage because they think they do. And if you think they have it as well, then they have it. So it might not be really real leverage, but it might just be perceived. So the perception really is the reality in this case, and you have to really understand who's perceiving that they have the leverage and who's perceiving that you have the leverage. So the first step in this is to audit both sides to understand who's got the leverage. So I've listed out some factors here. You can see time, competition, marketability, opportunity, and so forth. Time is a really easy one. Who's in a hurry? And if you determine that the other side appears to have a deadline, you might test that by slowing down a little bit and just seeing if they get anxious. If they've got a hard deadline, that gives you leverage in the negotiation. Competition is one that everybody understands. As sales and marketing professionals, you know that if you've got a lot of competition, the buyer has the leverage. If you don't have a lot of competition, then you know that you have the leverage, and that's always the case in a monopoly type of situation. So you're going to want to go through each one of these, try to audit who you think has the leverage, and then the next step, which is important, is to test that perceived leverage. So you might think that you don't have leverage, but maybe you do. Or you might think that they have some leverage that they really don't. So test those any way that you can and really understand who's got the leverage. And then last, you're going to want to manufacture perceived leverage. So I'm going to give you a little story here to illustrate how you manufacture leverage. And I should say how you manufacture perceived leverage. So back when I worked at Starbucks from '89 to 2005, we rolled out a DSL network to all of our stores. There's about 3,000 stores at the time, all across North America. A year and a half into that relationship, we realized that we were being overcharged for that service. And that's probably because we were the first ones to deploy a private DSL VPN. And at the time, it was the largest DSL network in the world. And a year and a half later, that vendor had a lot of customers on that system. And we knew that they were charging them a lot less money than they were charging us. So we sat down with them a year and a half into a 3-year contract and tried to renegotiate that relationship. Now here's the thing. They knew how hard it was for us to roll that network out. It took us a year, and it was a lot of store visits, a lot of churn, and a lot of overhead, and a lot of cost. So they knew we didn't want to switch networks. They knew we didn't want to roll out a different vendor's network. And so they had all the leverage. The reality was they had the leverage. So we were faced with this question of how do we manufacture some perceived leverage? And here's how we did it. We had a T-Mobile hotspot in our stores. It was in about 1,500 stores. And the T-Mobile hotspot, if you remember back in the early 2000s, that was back when you had to pay for Wi-Fi in a coffee shop. And Starbucks was the first one to come out with a Wi-Fi solution in all their stores. And it cost some money because it was really T-Mobile's hotspot service. It wasn't run by Starbucks, it was run by T-Mobile. And so one of the things that we had in our agreement with T-Mobile is that we could run our business systems over their network, since they were running a large pipe out to the stores to handle that traffic in the store of the customers that wanted to use Wi-Fi. So what we did was we took 50 stores away from our current vendor, and we ran the business systems over T-Mobile's hotspot. That allowed us to sit down with them at the negotiating table and say, look, you know that we don't want to switch. We know we don't want to switch, and so do you. And you also know that you're overcharging us, and so do we. So we need you to bring this price down to a reasonable level. Otherwise, we're going to take 1,500 stores next month and move them over to T-Mobile. And you know we can do that because we just proved we could. And then over the next year to 2 years, we're going to move the other 1,500 stores over to another provider. That gave us the leverage for them to take us seriously, and they did. And we were able to bring significant savings down out of that contract. So here's the important thing to know here. We wouldn't have switched and run all of our stores over T-Mobile, but they didn't know that. So it created the perceived leverage. Why wouldn't we have done that? If you remember back in the early 2000s, that was kind of a new thing to have Wi-Fi in the stores. And the big concern was if a person in the store could hack in through the Wi-Fi and get into the business systems and steal customer credit cards, that would be a massive publicity issue for the company. So we really wouldn't have run all the business systems over T-Mobile, their hotspot. Nowadays, that's not a problem because there's new technology that allows you to run multiple VPNs over the same pipe and have them be secure and separate. But back in the early 2000s, that wasn't the case. So we really wouldn't have run all of our stores over T-Mobile's hotspot. But the incumbent vendor that we were running our business systems through didn't know that. And so that created the perceived leverage that we needed to renegotiate the contract and get it to a price that it needed to be at. So that's an example of manufacturing perceived leverage. In every vendor selection, if you go through this process of defining the leverage, testing it, and that gives you enough time to try to figure out if you don't have the leverage, how can you manufacture some? And if they have leverage, how do you downplay the perceived leverage that they think they have? And so I'm going to leave you with a final quote that I like to tell people, which is, negotiations are won or lost before they begin based on perceived leverage. It's a lot easier to negotiate when you've got the leverage. It doesn't take as much skill and gambits and tactics and so forth to try to negotiate when you've got all the leverage and the other side knows it. So in summary, we've got 5 best practices. Formalize your vendor selection process. Use a scoring matrix to enable an educated and objective decision. Use an online RFP tool for efficiency. Make sure that you have stakeholder alignment on the decision. And last, optimize your perceived leverage for negotiations. So if you have any questions at all, feel free to shoot me an email at alan@peakportfolio.com or visit our website for more information. Thank you very much, and best of luck in your sales technology vendor selection and negotiations.